Greetings, dear listeners. Returning to the podcast today is friend of Wisdom of Crowds, Peter Beinart, a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times and editor-at-large at the magazine Jewish Currents. Since the terrorist attacks of October 7th and the ensuing war in Gaza, Beinart has emerged as a leading American Jewish voice wrestling with the ethics of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. His new book, titled Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza, A Reckoning, is already making waves. Before we get started, a reminder to head on over to wisdomofcrowds.live and consider becoming a paying subscriber, if you're not one yet. You'll get access to, among other things, the full conversation, as well as other subscriber-only benefits. And don't forget to give us a like and review on your favorite podcast app. With all that out of the way, on to the show.
Peter, great to have you on. Your new book is called Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza. It's a fascinating book, and as the title suggests, also a very personal one. And that's where I'd like us to start, the personal. And you do allude to this in various ways. Your intro is about a kind of schism with a friend who is unnamed. But clearly this has affected your relationships, your friendships. You are an observant Orthodox Jew, and I believe that your kids go to a Jewish school, so you're very much part of this world. And
used to, yeah.
Okay,
used to. Yeah.
Yeah, so you're very much part of this world, and I think you also gesture at the fact that you're not really welcome at some synagogues, and that there have been efforts to, in effect, excommunicate you. To say that you're not a real Jew, despite the fact that you're an observant Jew. So maybe just unpack that a little bit for us. And we should say, for those listeners or viewers who aren't familiar with you, Peter, that you are an outspoken defender of Palestinian rights, and that's why you find yourself at odds with a big chunk of your community. So take that wherever you will.
Sure. I mean, I guess, look, as you know, both you know, that there are plenty of Jewish critics of Israel, including, some fairly high-profile ones. I think probably what might make me a little bit different from most of them is that my personal life is kind of in the observant Jewish community, which tends to lean more to the right, and so there's a kind of a big misalignment between my political views and the way where I live my life, which is not really solvable in the sense that. The way I want to observe Judaism requires me to be in spaces that where there's a lot that I find very, very important and meaningful, but tend to lean politically to the right. And so in those spaces, I felt that I had more of a equilibrium with those spaces, which involved, I think, partly just like trying to be a mensch and trying to like treat people well and trying to recognize that like. You don't always need to have political conversations with people. I don't bring my political views into shul. I can do that the other 6 days of the week. They don't need to hear. I don't need to bring my protests in there. But after October 7th, the intensity level has become much greater. And also because my views are public, even if I don't feel like I'm bringing them into shul, people at shul may be seeing them anyway, right? Because they may be looking at the stuff I produce. So. It's been challenging. I mean, again, challenging in the kind of way of the problems you have if you live on the Upper West Side of New York. Not challenging in the way if you live in Gaza, you don't have enough food, and hundreds of your family members are being killed. So it's the problems of a very, very privileged and secure life that I lead. But I wanted to write the book in a way to those people because I'm in some ways fascinated. They're sometimes appalled by me. I'm kind of fascinated by them because I'm trying to figure out how can people who I know live really are thoughtful lives, thoughtful, self-conscious, often very kind and empathetic lives, and in the way they approach many things, I feel like here a wall goes up, and a whole different discourse and approach to life emerges. Now, that's probably not Trump. I'm not talking about like very Trumpy people. There are parts of the Jewish community where I think there might be a greater congruence between, but I'm talking about people who generally, in other areas, have a very different value system than I think the one they apply to Israel. And so that was, in some ways, I wanted to write to those people because I had felt like I had failed to explain myself effectively to them. But I also wanted to try to think about what's gone wrong in Jewish discourse that has made the test of whether you are a good Jew your fidelity to the state, right? Which, as I argue in the end of the book, seems to me actually a kind of idolatry.
Yeah. So this is a really good question, and I find some of these people fascinating too. It's also frightening to see people who you might be friends with having views that you consider morally abhorrent. When I see friends of mine or acquaintances, and they just don't seem to have any sympathy for Palestinians or any real sense of what has been lost in Gaza.
Yes.
Maybe they'll make some gesture to, oh yeah, civilians were killed, but then it's sort of like, well, that's Hamas's fault. That's the kind of default that people fall back to very quickly. What did you find, like, in exploring this? You said that you find these people fascinating and you want to understand them and you want to have a dialogue with them. What have you found? Because I think you're pointing to something very real that, as far as I understand how you see Judaism, Peter, you see it as having a very strong emphasis on universalism and justice. Yet these are people who don't seem to think about justice as it relates to Palestinians. Palestinians are just removed from the picture of justice.
Right. Now, it's, of course, I have to say that Judaism, like any great religion, has many, many different voices. So it would be very wrong for me to try to essentialize it and say it's about justice as we might understand justice in 2025. But I think the argument in my book is that there is a certain story that has taken root, certainly in American Jewish discourse. It's somewhat slightly different in Israel, but there's overlaps, and in other diaspora Jewish communities. And I think one way of understanding this story is to start to think about what a kind of older religious Jewish story was about Jewish suffering. I think if you look in Jewish texts, again, this is a gross generalization, but I think, and you ask the question, why are Jews suffering, right? Because Jews have, why are Jews tend to be kind of pushed around and persecuted in a lot of places? The traditional Jewish religious answer is about sin, right? It's that basically we've sinned and we're being punished by God, right? And, if you just read the Hebrew Bible, there's a lot of that, right? The Hebrew Bible is about a lot of it is about the relationship between the Jewish people and God is often very, very angry, and it makes that very clear, and the Jews suffer, right? And so, in a way, that is, like you could say, the kind of pre-modern story. So if you, read Jewish texts about the destruction of the Second Temple, which is considered kind of like the central kind of tragedy of antiquity for Jews, the Romans are almost an afterthought. The Romans are just God's agent to punish Jews because Jews sinned in various ways. And so Jews need to repent, they need to follow Jewish law, and then they need to pray, and then God will hopefully do better things for us. But that logic, we still exist in parts of the ultra-Orthodox world. Doesn't sit very well for modern people, right? If you were to, when you have ultra-Orthodox discourse about the Holocaust, sometimes engages in this kind of thinking, and most Jews understandably find it abhorrent, right? How could you possibly tell a story about the Holocaust and think about in terms of Jewish sin, right? But I think, so it's understandable that people are not comfortable with that story. But I think the story that has kind of largely replaced it is what I call the kind of virtuous victim story, which is to say, for some reason, Jews are fated to be history's permanent victims, right? And our role is to survive that victimhood and protect ourselves as best we can. And what happens then, that's the way Jewish sacred texts get read, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict gets read into that context, right? So after October 7th, the language that's immediately used is, there's the Palestinians are Amalek, right, which is figure first emerges in the book of Exodus, kind of the embodiment of pure Jew hatred, right? Then it's the largest killing of Jews since the Holocaust. It's suggesting that there's something about this which is like the Holocaust, right? And then the third is that it's a pogrom, which is to say it's like what happened to Jews in the Russian Empire in the in the 19th and early 20th century, right? And so Palestinians just become the reincarnation of the monsters of the Jewish sacred and secular past, right? Which is actually a very dehumanizing way of thinking about Palestinians, right? And it completely erases certain really important realities about Israel and Palestine, in which it's not Palestinians who are the legal inferiors, like Jews were, the Jews were in Germany or in the Russian Empire. It's Palestinians who are legal inferiors, right? And so you completely erase that context.
So, just to jump in, Shadi knows this, and some of our listeners do too. I don't know. I've taken it upon myself as a heathenist man raised by heathens to read the Bible. So I'm working through the Old Testament now. I think I'm at 1 Samuel now.
Good for you.
But you mentioned the Amalek thing, and
right.
In the context of reading this last summer, I also came across this essay by Simone Weil about the Iliad. I don't know if you ever saw that one. We'll put it in the show notes for listeners. It's a terrific essay.
Okay.
It talks about basically violence, and she's I think I might be butchering this. I think she was born Jewish.
Yes, and converted to Catholicism. It became a very serious Catholic.
And the striking part of the end of that very short book is how inhumane she finds the Old Testament. And specifically these parts of, which, and so all I just want to gesture at there is, as you said, it's one of the world's great religions. It contains multitudes and the rest of it. But the striking thing about the Old Testament, am I reading it, is the land, right? It's the parts that I've read in any case is the destiny of the Israelites to the land, and again the incredible sort of callousness that God himself has towards and furthering this. Now I don't want to get into I'm so out of my depth. I don't want to get into a big theological discussion with you, but I would just want to throw it out to you. Yeah. I'd love to hear you react to that tradition. That's all.
Right. So I think it's really, really important what you're saying. I think the first critical thing to understand is that Jews don't read the Hebrew Bible, what some people call the Old Testament, in the way you did. That's, I think, a Protestant move, right? Is to go to the text and say, let me understand it on its own terms. Jews traditionally only read the Hebrew Bible with rabbinic commentary, right? This is the Babylonian Talmud behind me, right? Jews, if you literally in school, the kids read the Rashi's commentary, the medieval commentator, to understand what this text means. You don't get to say, this is what I think it means, right? And the reason that actually is so important is the rabbis create the Talmud in the wake of the destruction of the temple and the failure of the Bar Kokhba rebellion against the Romans, and essentially they tend to turn these stories of militarism and politics and struggle. Essentially, they invert them, right? So if you look in Talmud and you look at Midrash, David is turned from the warrior king into the yeshiva scholar, right? And so it'll say David was battling over, his war was essentially inside the yeshiva, right? So this is how, in some ways, there's a kind of scaffolding that's put over these stories. And one of the things, in rabbinic tradition, which is in exile, people don't have armies, right? One of the things that Zionism does, in a way, is it undoes that scaffolding. And in a way, there's a kind of Protestantism in Zionism, in the sense that, like someone, David Ben-Gurion was not an observant Jew. He didn't observe Jewish law, but he was fascinated by the book of Joshua, right? And I think that you find in Israel, in Zionist discourse, a kind of return to the plain meaning of the text and a valorization of exactly the books that you're talking about. Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, even some of the names that are popular among Israelis. If you ever think about the question, why do we have two Israeli prime ministers named Ehud? Right? Have you ever met an American Jew named Ehud? Right? No. Some of these names that are popular in Israel, but you don't find among American Jews, are precisely from that part of the Bible, from those early prophetic books, which are books of conquest and military valor, because that's what the Zionists wanted to elevate. Whereas we Americans, are in our kind of little Woody Allen-esque, Woody Allen-esque kind of rabbinic Jew tradition, we tend to be a little bit less connected to that.
So then, just a quick follow-up on that. So when you're talking to, friends friends here in the States who you're finding transformed.
Yeah.
Are you finding, again, sort of a rollback of that rabbinic tradition, that they're falling back into this kind of, Old Testament, again, pardon the Christian thing, but, the Torah sort of literal reading of the scripture, or something else is going on?
I think American Jewish discourse is a bit different than Israeli Jewish discourse because it has to Israeli Jewish discourse is often, especially these days, much less sanitized, right? Israeli Jewish discourse, in a way, can sometimes be more honest than American Jewish discourse or American Jewish discourse in general. Because the American discourse, including American Jewish discourse, is often trying to take what Israel's doing and put it in a framework that has some patina of kind of universal morality and human rights, right? And so that's why you need to say that, it's Hamas's fault because of the human shields or whatever. I think Israeli discourse, for the most part, tends to be kind of often a more nakedly kind of realist, it's us or them, it's a harsh world, this is just what it is kind of thing. So a lot of what groups like AIPAC and do is they essentially are trying to translate what happens in Israel into a kind of more palatable discourse for the U.S. Mm-hmm. Again, on the far right, they don't really bother with that in the Jewish world, but in the kind of center. But I do think what has happened, so there's a difference. It's not, people here don't necessarily talk in the same way as people in Israel do always, but what is the same, I think, is this elevation of fidelity to the state over fidelity to Jewish law. And that's what's so striking. So I quote in my book this statement from Hillel, which Hillel is the Jewish organization on campus, right? And they have this statement of radical pluralism, which basically says, come all Jewish students. We don't care if you keep Shabbat. We don't care if you keep kosher. We don't care if you have any relationship to Judaism, right? Which is a striking thing, right? I don't know if the Christian organization on campus would quite say that, right? But it has very, very firm rules on your views related to Israel, right? On that, they're actually very tough, right? And so this is, to me, shows the way in which the true test of Jewish fidelity, of Jewish loyalty, becomes relationship to the state, not relationship to the religious tradition. And that's very much here in the U.S.
So, Peter, obviously religions contain multitudes. That's worth emphasizing.
Yes.
There's another strain of the Jewish tradition that you talk about at the beginning of the book.
Yeah.
And it's sort of delicate for an outsider to sort of jump into this internal conflict. But you do talk about how there are friends or former friends in the Jewish community who you see as being tribal. You use the word tribalism.
Yeah.
You also use the word fanaticism. And I'll just quote something from the introductory chapter, which is your note to a former friend, where you say this. You're speaking to him or her. You say, quote, "I see you as a kind of fanatic, but there is a part of me that suspects it is your fanaticism that has sustained our people in a pitiless world." End quote. So here you're getting at a kind of paradox. You obviously see fanaticism as very negative, as I think most of us would see it.
Right.
But you're also acknowledging for a people like the Jews that have suffered so much and have been victims so much in different historical episodes, that maybe you need to be a fanatic. You need to have this single-minded devotion to protecting and preserving your people at any cost, even if that means you're being tribal and you're prioritizing your own over the kind of universal.
Yes.
So help us understand what's going on there, because
Yeah, I mean, I think I was trying to express my own ambivalence, which exists. The book, I believe very deeply in the universality of human rights and universal obligations to all people. But there is a part of me that there's another voice inside my head that sometimes it maybe sounds like my grandmother's voice a little bit, which essentially says, like, don't be naive. Like, this is a world of power in which people either look out for their own or nobody looks out for them, right? I mean, and you hear this in Israeli discourse a lot. I mean, the Israelis will say, look at people who don't have states of their own. Like, look at what happens to them. Nobody gives a shit about them, right? And I think that, and because I spent a lot, and when I see people, one of the things that I see a lot in my neighborhood and in my community is a lot of people wearing dog tags to remind themselves of the hostages all the time. And when I see those folks, I think on the one hand, your politics are probably very different than mine, and your politics are probably very troubling to me. But if I were one of those people, right, who was a Jew who was in distress, right, it's this intense tribalism, which often comes at the expense of concern about Palestinians, that leads to this ferocious sense of Jewish solidarity. There's the famous line from Jewish scripture, Kol Yisrael Aravim Zeh Bazeh, all Jews are responsible for one another, right? And so there's a part of me that does feel at the end of the day, like maybe in the worst of all dystopias, like in which all human rights and morality and international law have been proved to be peacefully meaningless, those are the people who will protect me, and so that's my own, I think, internal struggle.
It's like the zombie TV shows where it's the least moral people who tend to survive and be killed by the zombies. But Damir, before you jump in, I just want to bring up one potential concern that occurred to me while I was reading the book, which is when you talk about things like tribalism and the idea of Jews sometimes perceiving themselves as being a people apart, that they're not like the rest of us.
Right.
Do you worry that can be weaponized by actual anti-Semites who might read parts of your book or skim it and, not take all the other parts? And because there are people who do use this kind of line of argument that, oh, look, Jews are tribal, they have dual loyalties, these kinds of traditional anti-Semitic tropes. So how would you respond to that potential concern?
Right. I mean, look, Jews are not the only group of people who are tribal, right? Lots of other groups are tribal. Americans turn out to be pretty darn tribal these days. They seem to think that if you don't have a U.S. passport, a lot of these people who are in power now, you're basically you're worthless. You have no value as a human being. I guess I would say a couple things. First of all, because people do ask me this question a lot in the Jewish community, like, I sometimes say jokingly that even if I were determined to air as much Jewish dirty laundry as possible, I could never get as far as the Hebrew Bible, right, which is basically one long series of stories about Jews acting badly. And in fact, Jews read on Yom Kippur this famous story that the Roman emperor says to Rabbi Akiva and the other rabbis before he kills them, I read the story of what the sale of Joseph, and I'm going to make you pay for that. So I'm going to basically, because I've heard this story about all the bad things you did. So I think we have a tradition of being open about our faults and failings. And beyond that, I mean, my argument about chosenness is precisely that actually my understanding of chosenness, and I take this from Yeshayahu Leibovitz, the Israeli social critic, is that chosenness doesn't mean that Jews are any different than any other group of people in our natures. It just means we have a separate set of religious obligations, a separate set of commandments, right? And our aspiration to holiness has to do with how well we do in achieving them. There's nothing inherent in us that makes us any better than anybody else. It's just that in our understanding of religious tradition, God gives different kinds of obligations to different groups of people.
So, what's really fascinating about this is what you said earlier about this, sort of universal conceptions, which you as a Jew in America has, and then sort of the Israeli conception, which, as you said, is more realist. Even as you're talking about that question of threat, small countries all around the world, I know, because I'm from one, but, I mean, you travel to like the country of Georgia, for example, they look up to Israel. They look up to Israel because they're a small country that does not take shit, basically. And that's a global reality that is actually, I think, just very occluded to many Americans because we live in America, right? And America's big and we're powerful, or at least we were super, predominantly powerful. So I mean, I just throw that out there as an anecdote. But the maybe the bigger question, sort of for reflection, there is obviously this is a personal book, and it's a book about American Jews, yourself, your community, relating to what's going on and what has happened in the Middle East. But how much is it also like a broader book, would you say, about just, America in the world? And I mean, this is something Shadi can definitely relate to, because he's on your page as sort of a, American exceptionalism in this kind of universal values thing, but existing in a world that is increasingly getting more and more barbaric.
Right. Partly because of America.
But yeah, I mean, or partly because we're unable or unwilling to keep the peace. But again, the question is, what's the state of nature ultimately? But take that wherever you want.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much that's interesting there. I think you're totally right that these, that Israel is a model for a lot of countries for a variety of reasons, but partly of the sense that, you can't fuck with Israel, right? But I do think that there's a difference, I think, between Israel and, let's say, these countries that have, emerged in the shadow of the Russian or even German kind of like great power brutality. I mean, Israel is the regional superpower in the Middle East now, right? It's not on the border of another more powerful kind of great power, right? It is a regional superpower, but it's also sustained only by its relationship to the United States. It's sustained by its relationship to the United States. I mean, they wouldn't have enough weapons to do what they're doing in Gaza without us constantly resupplying them. And so even from, I guess, part of what I would argue is and try to argue a little bit, is even from a very kind of realist perspective, I don't think that the path that Israel is going on is a wise path. It's true that a lot of people in the Middle East now are cowed by Israel and see advantages from Israel's economy. But the more Israel does, the more I think, first of all, it puts pressure on the existence of those regimes, because Arab public opinion is still, I think, extremely hostile to what Israel is doing, and I think hostile to Israel in general. But beyond that, I don't think Israel's primary threats come externally. I think its primary threats are internal. Its primary threats, as we saw on October 7th, is you're living cheek by jowl with these people. You're holding them under a system of brutal oppression. You are not offering them statehood. You're not in a state of their own. You're not offering them equality in the state in which they live. You think you have on October 6th, Israel thought they had this management system in which they, through sticks and carrots, Naftali Bennett, when he was prime minister, he really liked this book by Micha Goodman, who sometimes used to write for The Atlantic, called Catch 67, which was basically like, to put it crudely, like, we're never going to give them their freedom, but we can treat them a little better so they don't rebel, right? And we can give them a few more jobs and economic incentives and this kind of thing. But it just doesn't work very well over time, right? And the Palestinian Authority, which is one management system, is weakening in the West Bank. And Hamas, turned out not to be willing to play this game on October 7th in a horrifying way. And so now you see that the mainstream Israeli response is now basically mass expulsion, right? Now, again, maybe it'll turn out that me, the moralist, I simply can't understand the truth, which is that Israel will succeed in what we could call like a 19th century American solution to the Palestinian problem, right? And there's a book by Amos Oz called In the Land of Israel, where he goes to interview this guy he calls Z, who's a very ferociously right-wing. And Z says, listen, we need to exterminate the Palestinians, you understand. But after that's done, you can feel guilty about it. And the world will really appreciate all the guilt that you feel. Because look, people will appreciate that the Germans and the Americans are not guilty. But the Canadians and Australians are a little guilty. And he's like, that's where we need to be, right? And so maybe that will be true. Maybe Israel will get away with it, and it'll turn out that it quote-unquote, worked. And I just don't have the stomach for it. But part of me thinks that it won't work, and that what we'll have, God forbid, is more and more violence, not just against Palestinians, but against Israelis. Because think about all these people in Gaza and all these kids in Gaza, right? What are they going to want to do when they grow up, right? What are they going to want to do? They're going to want to take revenge, right? Because that's the way human beings are.
Yeah, look, I mean, I take... there's nothing to quibble with there. The only thing is again, coming from the Balkans and sort of how these sort of things perpetuate themselves for a long time. And again, I don't have to tell anyone has anything to do with the Middle East to understand that that's just a reality. But it is a question of perpetuation. I mean, it's not even a quibble, but just in the story you told is that, sure, Israel has no enemies right now of actual threat with, perhaps Iran, but whatever.
But they're much weaker than Israel.
Let's say, fine, manageable. But the story is not that, right? I mean, like the national story of Israel is not that. It's one of threat. It's one of being pushed into the water nearly, and that has a psychological effect. Which, this is again the question of sort of a history looking at it as a tragedy, but without necessarily being able to moralize it about it. And then your position, which is. Well, it's just still a tragedy, but, saying like we need to stop it right now, I guess, is your moral plaint. I look at it with horror and say to myself, it's like, my God, it's just going to perpetuate itself again. And this is maybe the next turn is exactly the horror you just described, right? But it's I don't know. So
what I fear.
I guess the question is how is that what's required? Just a moral cry to break this cycle? Is that like where you're? How do you even think about that?
I mean, I think that part of what Israel, I think Israel is doing what it's doing in part because it has had impunity. There hasn't had to. Netanyahu's whole political career, he's been arguing that Israel could do whatever it wanted to the Palestinians and not pay a price internationally. And his centrist opponents like Ehud Barak and Tzipi Livni used to argue, in fact, that Israel couldn't get away with that. Mm-hmm. And he said, look, just watch us. And America proved Netanyahu right, which I think is part of the reason for his political strength. So I think that an end to Israeli impunity potentially forces some kind of different conversation in Israel. Because I think any group of people who become, in my view, and you could tell me if you disagree, but in my view, people who become accustomed to legal supremacy, whether it's white Southerners or Protestants in Northern Ireland or white South Africans, they tend to associate equality with death, or at least with equality with their subjugation. And they don't wake up one morning and say, oh my gosh, I realize this is wrong, right? They start to be open to alternatives when the system stops working for them. Once resistance puts so much pressure on the system that it's not functioning effectively for them. And I think that there has not been that pressure on Israel that might force some Israeli elites to start looking for a kind of a plan B, whether that's still a Palestinian state, if possible. I think it's probably not possible, or something else, right? Because Israel hasn't had to have that internal conversation.
And there is something really odd about being by far the most powerful militarily superior state in the region, but also at the same time seeing yourself as a perpetual victim. I mean, that combination of power and victimhood,
yes,
I think is what is somewhat unusual here psychologically. But you do compare it to South Africa, which is white apartheid South Africa, which obviously for some of your readers is going to be controversial and maybe even beyond the pale. Can you maybe tell us a little bit more about why you emphasize that comparison? Because presumably that'll put some people off. They'll be like, oh my God, Peter Beinart is comparing Israel to apartheid South Africa in this very direct way.
Right. So people will sometimes say, how can you call it apartheid? Because apartheid is an Afrikaans word that means apartness, right? And the Israeli political system is not exactly the same, right? So, for instance, no black South Africans could vote, whereas a minority of the Palestinians under Israeli control, the Palestinian citizens, the Arab Israelis, can vote, even though about 70% of those under Israeli control, the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, cannot vote, right? So there are differences. But apartheid under international law simply means a legalized system of group domination and discrimination over one group, right? So that's why, most people don't really get upset if you call America in the 1930s an apartheid state, right? Because they understand that it's not exactly the same, but they understand what they mean by that, legal domination, right? And the harsh truth, which I never really thought enough about, the truth is that, talk about getting myself in trouble. Israel has now done things that are worse than anything that apartheid South Africa did. Because actually, apartheid South Africa never had an equivalent of Gaza. And the reason it didn't was because black people were the workforce. So you could not really, for your own self-interest, you couldn't really slaughter or expel these people in mass numbers because you needed them. And whereas what's so frightening about Israel-Palestine is Palestinians are a disposable population. Israel figured out how to largely replace with Filipino and Thai and other workers coming in, so they don't require Palestinians have much less influence as a labor force in Israel, which means that you can do this kind of thing to them. The reason I think it's only one analogy of a number that I offer, but the point that I'm trying to make in all these analogies is to help Jews de-exceptionalize Israel-Palestine and see that we are not the only group of people who can't imagine equality under the law as safe, right? That's actually quite typical, but that actually equality under the law does generally turn out to be safer, because when you're not imposing so much violence on another group of people, and that group of people has a voice in government, the market for them to use violence goes down.
The scary question, though, right? I think in the last time we had you on, we talked about, and you just alluded to it earlier, right, that the two-state solution feels unlikely. So we're left with other kind of arrangements, which include some kind of one-state solution, presumably still. And that this is where the apartheid thing, I think, for Israelis has to ring even worse, because actually, I mean, of course, it's not like, but it's numerically and otherwise politically, white South Africans have become very much a minority in that country, and politically, and that runs against the sort of idea of Israel, right? Of like purely enfranchising of Jews in the Middle East and Israelis. And so, I mean, that's tough, right? That the one-state solution in that context, in the context of that, has to be terrifying.
It is terrifying for most Israeli Jews and many, many American Jews, right?
Yeah.
Because there's this assumption that Palestinians try to kill Jews because that's what they do for fun.
Sure.
So basically, the state protects you, and if the state supremacist state is not there, then you're at their mercy, right?
Yeah.
Which is what white South Africans thought about the ANC, which was considered a terrorist organization by the United States. It was not a nonviolent organization. The PAC, that ANC's rivals' slogan, unofficial slogan, was "One settler, one bullet." They were like, we're going to be massacred by these people, right? But I think the flaw to me in that logic, again, is that the way people respond is influenced by the way you treat them, right? It's like a kind of almost childlike point, right? Which is to say, why are Palestinian citizens, why are Israeli Jews less afraid of Palestinian citizens than they are Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza? A lot of Israel's doctors and nurses and pharmacists are Palestinian citizens, right? It's the same group of people. But those people, because they have some voice in government, they're much less likely to use violence, So that would be the argument that I would make. And the dirty little secret, which I think Palestinians understand, but Israeli Jews tend not to understand. If you look at post-apartheid South Africa, you look at post-civil rights America. Let's look at what the city of Atlanta looks like today, or you look at Belfast. Is not how much has changed, but the fact that how much has not changed, right? I mean, in fact, these deep-seated privileges endure even after conditions of legal equality.
Right.
White South African life has actually not changed all that much since the end of apartheid, which is a big problem, actually. But it's, what's amazing is how much privilege people have maintained.
But Peter, you are saying at the same time that hundreds, tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of Palestinians now have revenge on their minds.
Yes.
They want to avenge the death of their loved ones.
Yes.
Which, as you point out, is just human nature. I mean, there's nothing mystifying in particular about that.
Right.
But, I mean, last time we had you on, it was shortly after October 7th, and I don't think either of us would have expected it to go on this long and in such a devastating manner, and it's been shocking. But I think that in some ways the one-state argument becomes more compelling, but in other ways it becomes less compelling because it becomes harder to imagine these two peoples who hate each other now more than ever, living side by side. Do Palestinians really want to live in the same state as the very people who committed such atrocities against them? Like, maybe now there's, in a sort of counterintuitive way, the argument becomes stronger for just separate states. These people will never be able to live together.
Right. I mean, I think, part of the challenges that we have in answering the question is because Palestinians are not allowed to basically express themselves politically by holding elections, for instance, that it's really hard for us to know. I think you are right that there are some Palestinians who might say, yes, now this is an argument, now we want just separation, right? Except that it's really, again, the facts on the ground don't really, I think, offer that as a real possibility. There are other Palestinians who may have moved, let's say, in the direction of moving from a South Africa-style answer to an Algeria kind of style answer. I mean, I think in the actual historical story of Algeria is more complicated, but we tend to think of Algeria as basically just the story of the expulsion of the French settlers. But I think that yes, I think we are further away. We're further away from any just or peaceful solution now. But I also think that if there is that in a way, if you've dug yourself a hole, the first thing you do is stop digging, right? So if you're worried about Palestinians wanting to get revenge, maybe the first thing to do is stop brutally oppressing and killing Palestinians. Then you can think about things like a truth and reconciliation process ultimately, and a system of of providing people equal rights, and a kind of way in which over very long periods of time some of these wounds can heal, because as we know in our country, they take generations and generations to heal, right? But at least the wound isn't constantly being inflamed, and at least people have the chance to mourn with some dignity, which Palestinians don't even have now.
But that would require Israelis to stop seeing themselves as victims, for them to stop digging the hole. And that seems very challenging, because once victimhood is part of your identity, it's part of your identity. You have to essentially go against yourself to undo that. And you cite a couple of really interesting examples where when someone brings up to an Israeli commentator or politician, look guys, the whole world sees that what you're doing is terrible, but then the Israeli response will be, well, we're still right. Like, even if everyone else is saying that we're wrong, we still believe that we're right. That becomes how do you talk through to someone when they feel that way? It's just hard to get my head around that.
Yeah, I mean, and this is when this kind of discourse about of global anti-Semitism kind of emerges. You see, this is, they were always anti-Semites under the surface, and now they've just been given an opportunity to express it. I guess my feeling is that the kind of discourse that says, the thing about the Israeli discourse is that on the one hand it says, screw you. On the other hand, it's requiring the United States to continue to give Israel these weapons, right? It's not really saying screw you in the sense that, like, we don't care, we don't want to have anything to do with you, because Israel is dependent on the United States. It's also dependent on Europe. I mean, if Europe were to actually enforce the ICC rulings, and not allow, and Israeli military personnel had to worry about traveling, that they could get arrested if they traveled to Europe or something like that, that would be a big problem for Israel. So in a way, this discourse seems to me to rely in some sense on the impunity, right? That once the impunity starts to go away, then I think people have to have a tougher conversation among themselves, right, about what they're willing to give up in order to continue to give the middle finger to the rest of the world.
So, I mean, it's a sort of a similar way to ask Shadi's question. It's hard for me, as someone who doesn't specialize on it, but just also, I can't tell how dead the Israeli left is. And I think what I'm reading between the lines here is that if, these kinds of questions were foisted on the Israeli body politic, you might have a fighting chance. But I also get the sense that I mean, not just October 7th, but like Bibi's politics, like all of politics right now is happening to the right of the center in Israel. And like the question is, what happens after Bibi, and how does the right fracture almost into, this next configuration? Is there, so what you're saying is that constituency can be reborn with pressure from the outside, or do you have a sense something has changed fundamentally inside that might be difficult to? Yeah.
I mean, part of the problem is that we're dealing with, when we even use terms like the Israeli left, right, we're in some ways already in a bit of a hall of mirrors, right? Because who is Israeli, right? Half of the people under Israeli control are Palestinian, right? We don't call them Israelis, right, because they're not citizens, right? We don't even people generally in America, when they refer to the term Israeli, they don't even include the Palestinian citizens, who are 20% of the population, because we accept the ethno-nationalist framework, and because the word Israel itself is simultaneously the name of the state and also the name of the Jewish people, it almost seems weird to call a Palestinian an Israeli, right? And so basically we're only talking about Israeli Jews, right? And so yes, among Israeli Jews, there are barely anyone in Israeli politics in Jewish Israelis who supports a Palestinian state. There was a vote in the Knesset last year where no member of a Jewish political party voted for two states. But 20% of the citizenry, the Palestinian citizens, they're pretty supportive of a Palestinian state or equality, or they oppose the rock. I mean, they would be the bedrock of the Israeli left, in the same way that black Americans are the bedrock of the American left, because they're historically discriminated against group. It's just they're not equal members of the political system, right? And so they tend to get kind of factored out. So to me, when one thinks about Israeli politics and the debates between like Yair Lapid and Benny Gantz on one hand and Benjamin Netanyahu, I think it in some ways makes sense to try to think about this in terms of what was politics like in the Jim Crow South, right? Black people were not generally participating. Among white people, there was a general consensus about legal supremacy, but differences in strategy about how to maintain it. And I think that basically defines the kind of most of the Jewish political discourse in Israel.
Yeah, but I mean, you still need to get to that point to,
Right.
to be able to get out of the Jim Crow South. You needed to legislate against it ultimately, right? And to
Well, you need a civil rights movement.
the civil rights movement,
right,
sure,
right.
but I mean, you needed just like a legal framework to even like affect
Yes.
that change. So I
Yes.
mean, we're still talking about an Israel that is, and incidentally, I mean, to be fair, I do hear not Palestinian Israelis, but Israeli Arabs is the term I usually hear on
Yes.
for that thing.
Right.
So
Right.
again, like I mean, but I take your point that maybe
term,
they're not.
I can just say that term itself also speaks to the problem, right? Because
Yeah.
the term Israeli Arab is created as if to suggest this is not one group of people.
Right.
The Palestinian citizens are just the people who managed to not get expelled in 1948.
Right.
They're not generic Arabs. They're Palestinians. Anyway, go ahead.
Right? No. I take that point, but again, my point is just about the body politic. I mean, I think it's what you did there was just like to create a body politic that's there before us, but without the state basically to be able to enforce any kind of sort of thing and change. So you still need to get buy-in from the people in power somehow to
Yes.
be able to create,
Yes.
I don't know, a civil rights movement that Israel did have before that seems to have sort of gotten decimated, right?
Well, what Israel had, which was in summer of 2003, was a really massive revolt by centrist and liberal Israelis, based on their fear that Israeli liberal democracy would collapse for Jews. Right? There were people on the fringes of that movement who wanted to connect it to Palestinians, but the mainstream of the movement rejected any connection to Palestinians because they felt like it would delegitimize them within the terms of the ethno-nationalist discourse in Israel. So, in a way, that was an intra-Jewish kind of culture war, which had a lot to do with religious versus secular. But when people said, "Oh my goodness, Israel's going to go the way of Hungary," to me there was always something odd about that because. Yes, for Jews, maybe Israel is a much more vibrant liberal democracy than Hungary. But for Palestinians, it's much worse than Hungary, right? So it's as if you have to take Palestinians out of the picture in order to talk. And that's kind of what the protest movement often did, So and now you have like Yair Lapid, right, a centrist Israeli politician who was a big backer of that protest movement, who is backing the Trump plan for mass expulsion, right? Just to give you a sense of like how liberal democratic is that? Right, so that's the way I would understand that movement.
And that's a really good point, a useful way of looking at it, because I feel like there's always this carve out.
That's it for part one, dear listeners. There's a lot more where that came from. If you're not yet a paying subscriber, please head on over to wisdomofcrowds.live and become one. Help support our work. Hope to see you in the bonus.